Hey, do you want to know which game is never coming out? Not just unlikely to come out, like genuinely never being turned into a video game? Half-Life 3 gets thrown around as a meme and some unobtainable vaporware that never existed in the first place, but it gained momentum as a potential video game after a few interviews with Gabe Newell and the expectation that Half-Life 2 would get a sequel one day. Expectations surrounding future video games are always prone to change, and so sequels that are able to take advantage of low levels of anticipation are genuinely pretty incredible to witness. That is, if the original game is any good, because while a sequel to a terrible game is unexpected, it's not exactly for any good reasons. You can typically telegraph when a sequel is due for a game, but sometimes they catch you off guard and give you that healthy dopamine boost to stave off all of life's hardships. Failing that, just rewatch some reactions on YouTube. That tends to do it for me.
It feels like the right time to make this video, considering that we've just got done with E3 and gone through the process of predicting what games are going to come out and being pleasantly surprised when a sequel drops for a game that no one was expecting. But I want to remind everyone that E3 is no guarantee of anything, and sometimes we just get a new sequel dropped in front of us with little to no warning. So I love that, I live for that, and I want to share my passion for it with you today. Expect a few surprises.
It's worth remembering that a sequel being unexpected says nothing about the quality of the game or lack thereof. Perhaps a terrible game getting a sequel was more shocking than one that 100% deserves a follow-up, but then we have Rockstar over here making all sorts of different games up until 2013, where they've spent the last 8 years milking Grand Theft Auto 5 dry and stretching it across 3 different console generations, just in case there's someone out there who hasn't played this game yet. Todd Howard gets a bad rap for spreading Skyrim like butter across every console in existence, but at least Bethesda have promised us a PNG of the sequel for sometime near 2030, so they're moving in the right direction. And so are Rockstar, to be fair, because they did make one game in the last 8 years, and it's quite a big one. I mean, you're hardly going to get it confused for some breakout indie game.
Whoa! Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't surprising because Rockstar were always going to make a sequel to Red Dead Redemption, and I agree, considering how amazing that game was and how much of a shot in the arm it was for Wild West video games. Rockstar would be stupid not to. However, GTA 5 is doing really well, and it's got all this online play, and Rockstar are making a ton of money, so why would you do anything else?
You hear the term holding pattern banded around sometimes when referring to game franchises that have hit on a degree of comfort with their games, and I honestly believed that Rockstar was so comfortable with GTA 5 and its ever-expanding online game mode that they'd never really want to make anything new or exciting ever again. Considering the success they had with that game and the amount of money it made them and is continuing to make, it was actually very surprising when Rockstar teased the world in mid-October 2016 that something new was on the way and that it wouldn't have anything to do with Grand Theft Auto. I know with hindsight that a Red Dead Redemption sequel is a bit of a knockout blow to the video game industry, and obviously RDR2 fully justified its existence with gargantuan sales numbers and some very tasty review scores, but I need you to understand that Rockstar made Bully and LA Noire, and they were both really fun and unique games that never came close to getting sequels. There is a perfectly understandable assumption to make that Rockstar don't have much interest in pursuing sequels and making franchises beyond Grand Theft Auto and ones they've already finished like Max Payne, but contrary to all of this is the knowledge that Rockstar were planning out and developing RDR2 in 2013, before the GTA 5 malaise set in. Honestly though, so much of me didn't see this coming. I doubt I'll see GTA 6 coming either. So there's been a few sequels that have served less as a sequel and more of a series revival. This is a very common occurrence these days since game devs are running low on original ideas and are looking at older games for ideas that are worth revisiting with a bit more gusto. But I want to draw the line under series revivals and label them as not true sequels. Kid Icarus Uprising is a classic case that certainly fills a hole in the market for a new Kid Icarus game after the best part of 20 years, but it really doesn't function much like a typical sequel at all. That's not to say that a massive gap between games like this automatically disqualifies a game as an unexpected sequel, since last year we got a new Streets of Rage game, meaning that there's 4 of those in the world now, the last of which, before 2020, came out in 1994. Well damn, that's kind of perfect. Streets of Rage always struck me as one of those classic side-scrolling beat-em-ups that were rife in the 90s, but only occasionally carried over outside of that decade as technology improved and 3D games became more exciting to make and play. And so the lengthy hiatus for this franchise is nothing too surprising. What was surprising was seeing Streets of Rage wheeled out for another day in the sun just last year, with Streets of Rage 4 hitting a really nice sweet spot between churning out the classic aesthetic of those older games and updating it for more modern sensibilities. By all accounts, it's a great game that stays faithful to previous titles, but all I'm thinking is just, what was stopping people from making a sequel in the last 26 years? That gap is older than I am, what the fuck? The story goes that French developer .mu, yeah? Should have looked this one up, shouldn't I? They approached Sega with the idea after they had finished remaking 1989's Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap in more of a 2017 kind of style, and I think Sega didn't have much plan for Streets of Rage and were like, yeah, okay, you can do that. I'm not sure if some people at .mu were huge fans of Streets of Rage and were desperate to revive this franchise, but crucially, it is actually a sequel. Not just by the continuation of a number, but the story is set 10 years after the third game, as well as starring a lot of the same characters. That's probably the most shocking part of all, less so that Streets of Rage got a new game out of nowhere last year, it got a bona fide sequel instead of some kind of reboot. If Battletoads can do it, then frankly anyone can.
In theory, cult classics should be all over this video, considering that they often flip between being obscure enough that a sequel is always fairly unlikely, but also potentially having a passionate enough following that, you know, a sequel could be worth your while if you're willing to invest the time and money into something that may not 100% pan out for you. And yet we're 2 entries into this video, and I haven't mentioned one, so should we change that?
Public opinion on a video game is always subject to fluctuations based on how the publisher keeps it alive after its release, and while Okami initially brought back some very underwhelming sales numbers when it was released on the PS2 in 2006, at a time when most people were trying to save up money to buy its very expensive successor, it did have its day eventually. Its Wii port was more of a natural fit with the controls, but again, low sales didn't help much. It wasn't until various HD re-releases turned the tide in Okami's favour by capitalising on all that cult classic energy with some tidier graphics that helped to pull together a pretty significant fanbase. About goddamn time, but Capcom did try to take Okami in a different, incredibly unexpected direction when, in 2011, they enlisted the help of some guy who had worked on Ace Attorney games to create a sequel on the DS. And yeah, I'm really happy for you and everything, but why now? When the franchise is already struggling for sales and popularity and, you know, fans? Obviously, Okamiden is wonderful in a similar vein as Okami was, with the DS being perfectly suited to the brushwork that made the first game such a hoot, but this is hardly striking while the iron is hot. The iron's pretty much stone cold actually, and making a sequel to any game that didn't sell well is more akin to an ill-advised leap of faith than a well-informed business decision. If Okamiden was made after all those high-definition ports with the renewed excitement surrounding the game, then it'd make a lot of sense to capitalize on this and make something for the 3DS, but instead, Capcom made the bold decision to make a sequel at a really awkward time that, by their own admission, is more of a spiritual successor than a true sequel, despite having the original name as part of its title and being styled as a direct follow-up to Okami. Sure, I am happy that they were making this game, but I can't say with any confidence that I would have done the same if I was in their position. Even more pressing is how Okami is fairly popular now, and we haven't had anything close to a new game in the last decade, so who knows what rules Capcom are playing by. Clearly people just need to forget about it and we'll be fine. There's definitely some convenient timing to this video coming in the wake of 2021's version of E3 that mostly convinced me that COVID was right to cancel last year's equivalent as I sat there growing older while watching underwhelming conferences that talked about the Guardians of the Galaxy for just way too damn long. But importantly, E3 is the most predictable time and place to hear about a sequel. Despite the generally negative vibes surrounding E3 2021, Xbox and Nintendo had impressive showings that cut through the fluff and got straight to work with lots of new trailers and announcements. But whereas Xbox was showing off a game that looks better than real life, Nintendo provided a short update on the development of Metroid Prime 4 before announcing another new Metroid game to tie fans over. Except this wasn't just any old Metroid game, this is Metroid 5, which had me working out what game would count as Metroid 4 after they stopped numbering them with Super Metroid just long enough to be slapped in the face with this. Just Metroid. Oh! That's a word I haven't seen in a very long time. And hey, that's a fucking sequel.
The number of cancelled games that end up being revived in some capacity is unfortunately very small, considering that most creative types tend to want to wipe the slate clean and start again, and also the gaming climate moves so fast that you're often very far out of place from what you were working on with what is currently popular. And yet, Metroid Dread is a shining ray of light, of hope really, that these games can be revived and they can become something tangible for people to play eventually. Just so long as you're backed by someone with as much money to burn as Nintendo.
By all metrics, Metroid Dread is a game and a concept that suits this video down to the ground. Bear in mind that this game is still a few months off being released, and therefore I have no idea how good it is, or if I'm setting myself up for a million miles of hindsight, but from what we were shown at E3, this is an incredible bomb to drop out of nowhere that has some substantial history behind it that all pointed to there being little to no chance of this game ever seeing the light of day. Dread was conceived as a DS game for the mid-2000s, but canned after the technology of the time wasn't quite good enough to do the concept justice. And that's kinda crazy to think about, primarily because Nintendo don't often cancel video games. They pull the plug on consoles and expansions all the time, but most of the time they follow through with games, despite how bad an idea it might be sometimes. So looking in from the outside, clearly there was something seriously wrong with Metroid Dread, or seriously amazing. Or Nintendo and Yoshio Sakamoto were quietly biding their time for the right time and system for a new side-scrolling Metroid game, and one that seems like a fairly direct sequel to Metroid Fusion just the 19 years later. Nintendo out here rewarding loyalty and patience. F-Zero will have its day again one day. A sequel being unexpected ultimately boils down to having little or no expectations that a game that potentially deserves a follow-up will ever get one. Metroid Dread is perfect because a game being cancelled sets your expectations behind its eventual release to somewhere around zero, and so any future announcement like the one we got just last week is pretty damn surprising. Still though, a cancelled project at least acknowledges the one-time existence of something, a moment in time when there was a group of people who had intent to create a sequel before things fell apart. Okay, so how about a game that was unveiled live before a capacity crowd 14 years after the last one? Doesn't sound too crazy when compared to Streets of Rage, but considering how the world has moved on so much since the last Shenmue game, any further games in this series were never all that likely. Hey, it was the same E3 show where Sony re-announced The Last Guardian and casually dropped the Final Fantasy VII remake, so clearly there was something in the air. I always assumed that Shenmue was done after 2 games because of the type of games they were at the start of the century. They're very divisive due to how much they lean on QuickTime events and how they don't fall into the typical more popular gaming genres, but there's a fair chunk of the world that loves everything that these games have to offer and would argue that the dozens of millions of dollars pumped into its development were completely justified. Problem is that it's a very of-its-time game that, yes, is dominated by QuickTime events and likely wouldn't be completely out of place in a lineup of more modern games, but I don't think this type of game would translate well into a revamped sequel. Despite this, a third Shenmue game was announced on an E3 stage as a Kickstarter campaign, a set of facts that would have dropped the jaw of any fan or casual observer of this franchise at any point in the previous 14 years, and especially when it started to look more and more likely that the third game wasn't happening. Shenmue is now a trilogy, and I still don't know how. That means there's hope for all of us.
This is RabbidLuigi, and Shenmue 3 came out 2 years ago to some fairly mixed reviews that mostly complained about the game being too similar and not changing enough from the first 2 games, but honestly, I couldn't give a fuck, because Shenmue 3, in essence, is bigger than the game itself. It is concrete proof that these fantasy game reveals are possible if you're patient enough. Does that hold the door open for Half-Life 3? I mean, probably not, but, you know, where there's hope, there's possibilities. Hi, just want to give a quick shout out to some of my top supporters on Patreon. We have Ramon Alberto, Jerome Kiryu, Fusion Warrior, Sarah Malion, Christopher Robinson, Joe Creamer, Scott Riker, Frank Guillong, I think, I'm so sorry, The Green Scorpion, Devon Hutt, and Ferretto. Thank you all for supporting what I do on YouTube, and if you want to join them, you can go to patreon.com/RabbidLuigi, where I post updates and behind the scenes stuff, and we generally have a really good time. Also, what topic would you like to see me cover next? Leave your suggestion in the comment on this video, because I'll be taking the best ideas and making a poll on my community tab, which you can then vote on to decide what the next video is about. I'll be announcing the winner of the poll over on my Twitter, so make sure you follow me so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.